Everyone, thank you for joining us, hopefully again for one of our panel discussions for the Charleston Forum. This is the last of our discussions based on our 2020 Tri-County survey, and it is focusing on the one of the four pillars that we've addressed and that we continue to address about racial issues in our community. And this one is what we call the future of the past. It involves statues, monuments, road names, whatever it is that might cause some divide among people of different races based on our past, and what are we going to do about it in the future. So thank you again for joining us. We certainly want to thank our sponsors who have ensured that we're going to be able to do our 2021 programming, which is going to be a survey of actual proposals of how we're able to bridge the gaps that we found in our 2020 survey. What will the majority of people support doing to address the problems that we've identified through the 2021 survey? And so I want to thank our most recent sponsors that include our Ed Westbrook, who's been a very good friend for us throughout, along with the El Hapa Foundation. Thank you. And the Steinberg Employee Community Fund Committee. So thank you to all the good people at the Steinberg Law Firm for your support. And if you are able to sponsor, we'd obviously love to have your support. But even if you're not able to sponsor, please spread the word. We can only do as much good as a number of eyes see this, or a number of people who talk about what we're doing. Then we'll have more influence in things getting done. So please share this, share our Facebook page, share these videos, share the invitations with your network, and encourage them to share this further. And we'll continue to build a stronger community. Now, if you have an idea for a proposal that addresses something in education, economics, policing or criminal justice, or this topic, future of the past, that you think would be good to be included on our survey for next year, then please email us at info@thecharlestonforum.com, and we'd love to hear more about it. Now, a couple things about this topic, the future of the past. Respect is the foundation for all of our discussions through the Charleston Forum, and it is particularly true here because this topic is one that really drives a lot of emotion, or a lot of emotion drives opinions about these particular topics. So I ask two things of the community when we address this issue. And the first is, you don't have to set aside the emotion, but don't let it run you out of the conversation. You've got to set it aside, or be able to get over it enough to have a reasonable discussion about differing views. So let's please do that. And the other one is that if you find yourself thinking or speaking to yourself in terms of what they want, or they need to do this, or they think that, I think we need to all redefine that and talk about it as a more inclusive we. When we look at the community and what we want to do going forward and think of it as we, it's a lot easier to accommodate different approaches on a path forward. So I'd encourage everybody to not let the emotion drag us down and keep us where we are, have a more inclusive perspective on how we can do something and build a stronger community. Because I'm convinced that the divides over these types of issues are the hardest ones to bridge. And as soon as we're able to get a bridge built here, then we will be able to do wonders in a lot of other areas to build a stronger community in Charleston and in South Carolina for everybody. So thank you for your interest and your commitment. And John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And welcome to everyone to our last installment of 2020's Charleston Forum. And as Brian mentioned, we're going to be talking about the future of the past. And I'm honored to be joined by two guests who are going to help shed some light on that issue, Robert Rosen and Reverend Demet Jenkins. And we may be joined by some other special guests during the course of our time together. We'll go until about 5 o'clock, and we'll leave some time for questions. So as you have questions, drop them into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and try to get in as many of them as I can during the course of our conversation. What I'll also ask our panelists to do is to feel free to ask questions of each other. And let's make this more of a discussion instead of an interrogation. I haven't done any depositions lately, and I don't want to do one this afternoon. So I want to begin by giving each of you a chance to introduce yourselves. And as you're doing that, if you could answer two questions and one word answer for each of these two questions. Uh, how would you describe Charleston of today in one word? And how would you describe or hope to describe Charleston 50 years from now, also in one word? And as you're providing that answer, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, who your people are, where you're from, and we'll get started. So, Reverend Jenkins, we'll begin with you, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so very much. I'm happy and honored to be on this panel. I don't feel worthy. I'm not a historian, but I am a person who grew up in this town and loved this city and came back home after being gone for about 24 years, came back in 2016. So I grew up in Charleston. My family is from Johns Island. My grandfather, my grandparents were civil rights activists, Esau Jenkins and Janie Bell Jenkins of River Road, Johns Island. And so I'm a product of a family who cares about community, who works hard to make sure that we are engaged in the community and that, we're gonna fight for justice. And so I come under that legacy of people who are just concerned about people, no matter what their color is. They're concerned about people and community. So I'm grateful to be a part of that legacy. I served as a social worker for many, many years, working with battered women and children who were part of the Department of Social Services system. And then later went back to school, and now I am serving. I served as a chaplain for Emory Healthcare and worked in the healthcare systems and currently working at the International African American Museum as the faith-based director. And so you wanted to know how I would describe Charleston today and 50 years from now. So the word I would use is undiversified in terms of describing Charleston today. And how I would see Charleston 50 years from now is uninequitable.
Thank you. Thank you for launching us, Reverend Jenkins. And so, Robert, we're gonna turn to you and learn a little bit about you for folks who don't know you and get your responses.
First, thank you for having me as well. And that's a tough act to follow. I knew Esau Jenkins as a young man. I've been giving a lot of thought to my own family history because, we are all thinking about local history. And my grandparents were all immigrants. And they were all Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So they left Belarus, Poland, Russia, 1900. Had they not left, I wouldn't be here because whoever they left behind were killed in the Holocaust. So when you think about the reach of history, of course, this is something I never thought about growing up. I grew up around Hampton Park. I went to James Simmons Elementary School, Rivers High School. My grandfather had a grocery store on King Street, and my father was raised over the grocery store, and my mother and my father went to the College of Charleston. I told the president of the College of Charleston the other day, if it hadn't been for the College of Charleston, my parents wouldn't have been able to go to college. And my father became a lawyer. He became a successful lawyer. I graduated from Rivers High School in 1965, and I can't believe how old I am, which makes me 73 in December. So it doesn't seem that long ago. So I grew up around Hampton Park, and as luck would have it, Rivers High School was the first integrated high school in South Carolina. Millicent Brown came to my high school. I met Millicent when she came, and you know, they picked Rivers High School for a reason. One reason was, you know, we talk about diversity. It wasn't diversity like we talk about it now, but we had a lot of Jews and Greeks and white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It may not seem like diversity today, but it seemed like diversity in 1965. So, of course, I grew up in a segregated world. And, you know, my children who are in their 30s are like, how can it be that you grew up riding in the front of the bus and the Black folks were riding in the back of the bus? I mean, but that's how not so long ago this was. I mean, in my lifetime, I lived in a segregated world. Of course, being white, I was in a more privileged part of that segregated world, but I mean, the restaurants were segregated. I went to segregated elementary schools, and only my last year of high school was there one Black student. So that's not exactly diversity or even integration.
Right.
I went to the University of Virginia, where I got very involved in social activism to get involved with getting more Black students at the school, and also protesting the war in Vietnam. So in the eyes of downtown Charleston, which I viewed as a repository of all things conservative, racist, and every other thing, which goes to show that the white community is not monolithic. In other words, I didn't know anybody really in downtown Charleston. Downtown Charleston was just as foreign to me as if I lived on Johns Island, really. I was uptown, and those of us who are uptown were not downtown. And so I did have the honor of being excoriated in the old News and Courier by Tom Waring, who called me a student radical back in the 60s, and was involved in the March on the Pentagon and all these things. So, you know, when Joe Riley came along, that was seen by me as a great moment in Charleston history. And that here's somebody that could bring the races together, bring people together. And of course, this is what makes life so frustrating for people my age. In 1975, probably half the people listening to this weren't even born then, Joe Riley ran as a candidate to heal the wounds of the racial divide in Charleston. Now that's almost 50 years ago, but it was a very bitter election between Ackerman and Gilliard in 71. The Black community lined up behind Joe Riley. Joe Riley did a lot of things. And I was assistant city attorney and was one of the lawyers in his administration. And I like to think I contributed in some ways to the progressive nature of what Joe Riley accomplished. I represented the school district. I practiced law. In my spare time, I wrote several books, A Short History of Charleston, which has been around since 1982, Confederate Charleston, which is a history of the Civil War in Charleston. And then I got interested in the Holocaust. I wrote a book about Franklin Roosevelt and the Holocaust. I wrote a book called Jewish Confederates, because I was sort of amazed at how Jews in the South could find themselves fighting on the side of the Confederacy. So that's a long story, but you know, if you invited me to talk about myself, that was a very
and now that we got that out of the way, what are your answers to the questions? So, Robert, you mentioned Joe Riley's run for mayor 50 years ago, and we know that if we look at Charleston now versus when he ran for mayor, it certainly changed. So, back to those kind of framing questions. If you look at it now, how would you describe it, and how would you want to describe it in 50 years from now? You got one word, counselor.
Well, I was going to say the one word I would describe Charleston right now is tense.
Tense.
I think people are tense. I think people are disturbed. How would I describe it in 50 years?
Yeah.
I'd like to say peaceful.
Thank you.
Maybe I'm showing my age.
Well, we want to get behind both of those responses, and now that Representative Moore is here with us, we'll give him a chance to get settled in, um, and give him an opportunity to introduce himself and give us his answers to those two questions.
How y'all doing? Sorry about that. I was having a little
That's quite all
technical
right.
difficulties.
Quite all right. Glad you could make it. We're just getting started, and you came in right on time because it's your turn, as it turns out.
Okay. Yeah,
that-
re-ask the question so I can prompt me, please.
The cue is a one-word response to each of these questions. How do you see Charleston today? In one word. And how would you see Charleston in 50 years? Also in one word. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself, just by way of introduction, so that everyone who's joining us today knows who you are and what you do.
Okay, thank you. I am J.A. Moore. I think the first superlative is I'm a father of a 16-month-old daughter, Mariah Ray Love Moore. I'm a husband to Victoria Ray Moore. I'm a son. I'm a community advocate. I'm a chef. And also I'm a South Carolina state representative. And people often ask me, J.A., how did you end up running for office and serving the people in District 15? That seems like a big jump from being a chef and being in the hospitality industry. And often I tell people that it's actually not. I've spent almost 20 years now serving people in restaurants and catering cafes and coffee shops. And this is just another way to serve. My parents ran a nonprofit for over 25 years. So I grew up serving others. I chose a career service, and now I'm an elected official serving the great people of Goose Creek, Hanahan, Moncks Corner, and North Charleston. One of the catalysts, I'll say this, that led me to run for office was, unfortunately, due to tragedy and the pain that people here in Charleston and South Carolina and the country, quite frankly, experienced. The assassination and murder of beautiful souls at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in downtown Charleston. And my sister Myra Thompson was teaching Bible study that night. And what that helped me realize that moment was how short life is. And whatever your purpose is, you have to do it now. And that led me to get more involved than I was before, some 5 years ago. And it was what, back in 2018, led me to run for office for the first time. And we just was reelected November 3rd of this year to serve the people for 2 more years. But to answer your question, where I see Charleston and quite frankly, the state and the country right now, when one word is transition. And where I see Charleston and the country in 50 years is transition. And if I may elaborate on that just a little bit, I tell people often that I believe that the past 5 years for this generation was similar to about 1963 to 1968 generation before us. And I think every generation deals with a transition period where we as a generation must decide whether we will allow progress to prevail or we will go with the status quo. And so what we will find over the next year or so is we will see whether progress will prevail or will it be the status quo. And I think we'll be in that same period 50 years from now. So I just believe that life, from experience and speaking to people and learning from people older than I, often repeats itself, giving us as citizens and as humans and inhabitants of the earth to get it right the next go round. And my hope is that this go round we get it right.
Thank you for that. And again, I am deeply sorry for your loss. This forum is a living memorial to those whose lives were taken at Mother Emanuel, and I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you continue to be honoring the legacy of those we lost. So I want to thank you for that, and spend some time talking about today, because in your three responses, Reverend Jenkins said Charleston today is undiversified. Robert said it's tense, and Representative Moore says that we're in transition. What would you like to see to move away from how you currently describe Charleston? And Reverend Jenkins, we'll start with you.
Yeah, as I shared earlier, I grew up here, and after college left and was gone for 24 years, came back in 2016. And when I came back, Charleston just looked very different to me. On one hand, it's a great city, and I've always loved Charleston. I've always brought friends here. But in terms of culturally, it just felt like I didn't see myself in the city anymore. I didn't see my people being represented in the city. I grew up where my family owned businesses on King Street. So we spent a lot of time on King Street and Spring Street. And Spring and King, in my memory, were very Black centered, African-American centered. And so to come home and see all of that gone, the businesses aren't there, the people aren't there, was just heartbreaking. It's disappointing. And I know a city has to grow, but I thought when we grow with everyone, that everyone has an opportunity to own businesses and to open stores and redevelop. And it just felt like it's missing. And so when people call me or ask me, oh, where can I go in Charleston? I have to send them all over. I have to send them to North Charleston, to Somerville, West Ashley, downtown. There's not centered places where they can go park their car and hang out and be able to, go to Black businesses and restaurants as well as the others. And so that's why I say it's undiversified. I don't see people of color downtown, not just African-American people. I don't see Latino, I don't see Asian. It's not present. And for such a beautiful city, for us to be the #1 tourist city, I don't feel like we're representing all the people who live here.
Thank you. Robert, you mentioned that you grew up away from downtown,
Right.
uptown, and in an area now that's changing itself. I mean, part of it is exactly where Reverend Jenkins is describing. What do you make of what she just said? That she doesn't see herself. Do you see the person you were when you were growing up in Charleston? Is there room for you?
What's funny about this topic is that everybody has been gentrified out of Charleston. In other words, the old families, when I was growing up, there was such a thing as old Charleston, and everybody knew what it was, or thought they knew what it was anyway. With all the old families who lived south of Broadway. Well, those people don't live there anymore. Everybody talks about gentrification as just involving Black folks, but the truth of the matter is, all the old Charleston people, they're living in Mount Pleasant. And I live downtown, and most of the people who live downtown are from Manhattan or Chicago. I guess affluence that, the city experienced an unprecedented affluence beginning in the 70s. And the result of that has been positive and negative. My old neighborhood, Hampton Park, I mean, that was a working class, middle class, white and black. I mean, on the other side of Rutledge Avenue from where I lived, Rutledge Avenue, and on the west side was mostly white, and on the east side was mostly black. Because, you know, kids I went to high school with, their daddies worked at the shipyard and the gas station. And, you know, there were a few lawyers and doctors, but I mean, it was economically diversified. But you know, those people don't live there anymore. That's now those houses are going for $500,000, $800,000. And so, you know, I guess the good news is whoever owned those houses sold them, made a lot of money, made some money. The big houses downtown, there's no, the old Charleston people, I don't know where they are. So, I mean, it's, the city's changed pretty dramatically.
You've seen that change too. And now that we've got our fourth guest with us, Mr. Beckman, I think you're on the phone there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yes, you're coming in loud and clear. We'd like for you to join this conversation and just start with your answers to a couple of questions, and one word each in answering those two questions. Where do you see Charleston today? And where do you see Charleston in 50 years from now?
John, I've been pondering this all afternoon, and I can't come up with a one-word answer. And I know, and from what I heard when I initially was on, but muted, unfortunately, I heard the same thing from everybody else. But
Yeah.
Charleston today is, and I just heard this same thing, it is not anything like when I grew up in Charleston.
Okay.
Now, I grew up in the same neighborhood as Brian, pretty much above Hampton Park, but had a lot of friends downtown throughout the city. And I'm not sure who made that comment before about the older families. They've dispersed. I mean, they're living every place, and some of the ones that I know that used to live down there, a lot of them have moved to Mount Pleasant because they can't afford to do everything else. But anyway, that's as of today. That's my good one-word answer. In 50 years,
In 50 years.
I don't know. I would kind of like to see, and I'm very familiar with the book Charleston Come Hell or High Water.
Mhm.
I would like it to be that same way, but in today's world, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that, because sometimes the answer is I don't know, or I'm not sure. And that's a good place for us to start as we think about the next thing that I want us to spend some time on, which is focusing on the symbols that describe Charleston's past and what those symbols represent. There's a famous quote by Frederick Douglass in his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And in that speech, Douglass said, and this was before the Civil War, as the abolitionist movement was taking off, he described America as being false to its past, false to its present, and solemnly binding itself to be false to its future. And my question for you all is, what would it mean for Charleston to be true to its past, true to its present, and true to its future as we see the current debate around statues and monuments and symbols of the past and what the community stands for? What does truth look like?
I think if we're gonna be truth tellers and have honest, transparent conversations, we have to have them without the elephant in the room. And we have to tell the truth of our own stories. You know, I try to say all the time that, you know, my grandfather was a civil rights activist. So, you know, whether I heard the message, whether I was told the message, but I always knew that I had to be mindful of white people. I always knew that.
Mhm.
And so, I think if we can begin to just tell our stories of what we've learned, what we were told, messages we've gotten, what we believe, and start there. I think people are afraid to say that because it may be a shun against their parents or their grandparents or even themselves. But if we're going to begin to talk about race and how it has impacted, what it has done, even what we personally think and feel, we have to be courageous enough to talk about what were those messages that you received as a child. Because if I can't really begin as an adult because those messages came long before I became this adult. What has been added to that as an adult maybe, but I think we got to stop thinking about I can't say that because I don't want to shame my family. I don't want to shame myself. We have to be open to say, what did you believe? What messages did you get coming when you grew up in your house? What were you told about people of a different race and or a different culture? What did you understand? Like, let's start there, because that is a beginning place of our own realities. And if we're going to talk about it, we have to tell our own truth. And I'm not sure if we're all courageous enough to begin there and have those truthful conversations.
What does it take to build that courage, do you think?
You got to be willing. You have to be willing. You have to be courageous enough to say, I'm just going to tell how I grew up, what was told to me, and what I believed. I tell people I have to work through every single day to not see someone of a different race and just make assumptions about them. That I have to work hard at sifting through that and seeing you as an individual and building whatever our relationship is and addressing you in that way and not categorizing you. I have to work at that. And I'm honest enough to say I have to work at that. I'm a minister, I'm a human being, I'm a social worker, I'm a chaplain, I'm a director of education, I'm all of those things, but I still have to work at it. And it's an everyday process. And I think if we can be courageous enough to have those tough conversations, keep that elephant out of the room, break it down, say what it is what was told to you, what your messages are. It may not be what you believe today, but that doesn't mean that's not what you heard or what you understood or what you believed, even
Right.
as a person.
Thank you.
If I could jump in there, I agree with you totally. The problem that I've run into in the past is keeping the elephant out of the room. Because when things are said, some people take it the wrong way, even though, just as you said, that's what you learned when you were growing up. Whether you still have those attitudes or whatever today, probably not, but still, the elephant's still in the room and it eventually will come out. But that's one thing I was hoping that when I was asked by Brian to join this forum, that we would be all sitting in one room so we could look at one another in the eye and really get to know the person.
Mm-hmm.
I've found myself, especially after the tragedy, having so many of these truth-telling moments with folks. And I think some of the challenges or the burden that a lot of my family members and those that were directly connected with the tragedy have to face is this burden of strength. Having to, everyone wants to have these racial conversations with you now because of the tragedy. Now you have to become an expert in race relations in a lot of ways. So I've had, hundreds of these conversations, not just here in South Carolina, but throughout the country. And I think it's vitally important for us to be okay with being uncomfortable. And it's all right to offend people if you're being truthful. I think you should do it in a respectful manner. But sometimes the truth isn't pretty, or the truth isn't a harmonious thing. The truth is sometimes just the truth. And so I think that's kind of what my learned experience has been, having these conversations around race, and especially race as it relates to economics. Minister Jenkins really hit a soft spot for me when it comes to the lack of economic opportunities on the peninsula in particular, but really throughout Charleston. There's a rich culture of Black entrepreneurship here in Charleston that a lot of folks either don't know about or have forgotten, and their stories aren't being told. So this is a priority of mine, and I'm doing stuff both in the private and public sector to change that truth.
Thank you for that.
And that's an excellent point. Just to camp on that just a little bit, and I think we talked about the elephant in the room. When you're talking about race and race relations, you have to take the blame out of the conversation. And by that, I mean, I wasn't born 150 years ago. I was born in 1947. So I had nothing to do with anything that happened 150, 200 years ago. So don't blame me for what you think is perceived that I'd had anything to do with it. And that's when I get a little, not testy, but I get a little uncomfortable when that happens. And then what eventually ends up happening, I end up just being quiet. Well,
I hope you're not quiet while we're having this conversation, and I want to continue it because you've taken us to a place where we need to go. If we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, and how different people see the past and representations of that past, I think it's worth considering the question: how do we decide who's worthy of being honored with a statue, with a monument, with some recognition?
Well, John. Well, go ahead, Carl. I'm sorry.
That's all right. The monuments and whatever monuments we have around the city, and my whole life and everything else, I majored in history in college, and I love history. I love Charleston's history, but it's all heritage and tradition. And it takes a while for that to simmer down or whatever the case may be. But being a student of history, you can only learn from history if you know exactly what happened. Now, in today's history classes, I don't think students learn because some educators think it's easier to rewrite history like it never happened. And I think that's a mistake because you can't learn from the past. And I'm a firm believer in lessons learned, that you can learn your lessons based on the past history. Don't rewrite it, put it out like it used to be, and then move on from there.
Well, you've given us a lot now to take, and I'd love to hear from any of the other panelists as how you respond to what Carl shared with us.
John, let me say this. I was chairman of the History Commission some years ago when we had a debate about the statue of Denmark Vesey. And I wrote an op-ed in the newspaper about why the Confederate flag should come down off the Capitol. And I wrote an op-ed about why we should have a monument to Denmark Vesey. And I got a call from an old Charlestonian. I won't call his name. He's no longer with us. He said, well, I agree with you on the first thing, on the Confederate flag. He said, I can understand that. He says, but I can't go along with you on Denmark Vesey. I said, well, why is that? He said, well, he set out to kill all my ancestors. He said, if he had succeeded, I wouldn't be here. I said, well, that's the point, you know? And, you know, the Denmark Vesey monument created a big controversy. I mean, I guess it's kind of old news now because it was put up a long time ago, but there were a lot of people very angry about it in the white community. The argument to me was, you know, I don't think we're going to reconcile how we view history. I mean, there are going to be people who are going to say that they think people like Denmark Vesey, who, you know, allegedly was going to kill all white folks and do all these things. You know, there are going to be people who are going to say that man is not worthy of being remembered. On the other hand, if you're in the Black community and here's a man who stood up to free people who are wrongfully enslaved, you would say he was a hero. Now, I don't know how you're going to, I mean, this is a debate that's going to go on sort of forever. People can disagree about it. I mean, my point was then and is now, we don't have to agree on every single point. In other words, Denmark Vesey is a heroic figure to me because he tried to organize, as best we know. It's hard to know exactly what happened because there's a lot of reasons why historians don't really know what happened, but he certainly is entitled to be remembered as someone who was going to end the slavery of people that everybody agrees is wrong. So, but there are people who disagree with that. Well, I don't know why as a community we can't just move forward. You know, we can have monuments that we like, and we can have monuments we don't like. I mean, my children all live in Manhattan, and I go to Manhattan, and there's a big, gigantic gold statue of William Tecumseh Sherman on Fifth Avenue. Well, William Tecumseh Sherman is one of the biggest anti-Semites in American history, okay? I ain't a big fan of him, and he said a lot of things about my people I don't really like. But you know what? He helped win the war for the Union. They built the statue to him. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, we are not always going to agree on exactly what happened in history or whether people are worthy of being remembered. I think what we need is to reach a consensus where everybody's story gets told. You know, Bernie Powers and I wrote an op-ed in June, and we said, build a monument at the Battery to the African-American heroes of South Carolina who fought against slavery. You know, build one bigger and better, a world-class monument, you know, at the Battery. You know, we have opportunities to build things, to say things, to make up for bad things that happened in the past, for people who have been forgotten. And under Joe Riley, some of that was done. I mean, there are monuments to Robert Smalls. There are things that have been done, not enough. So to me, I don't know why we really need to fight about this. I think we need to come together, tell everybody's story. That's
well, I think this is a good time to bring Reverend Jenkins into this discussion, given your work with the International African American Museum, which is meant to tell those stories, as you were saying. You started by talking about truth. How do you see this issue as to who we venerate, who gets to be remembered, how they're remembered, especially as we see it depicted in Charleston?
So let me just start by saying I wish that leaders like Dr. Millicent Brown and Cleo Brown and Damon Fordham and even my aunt Elaine Jenkins, I wish they were a part of this call and conversation, because these are folks who have, they are historians. They have lived through integration and just understanding Charleston's history. So I do want to call their names just to
Thank you.
allow their spirit to be a part of this dialogue. And hopefully as we continue to do more of these, that those folks will be added to this panel. But, you know, in terms of the monuments, you know, my advocacy is just if we're going to honor people, we shouldn't be honoring people that that support white supremacy or just support slavery, enslavement, like those things. I don't want to walk around and pay homage to that. I believe it's history and I don't want to erase the history. I can't erase the history, but I don't have to pay honor to it. And it doesn't have to be in the public places where I sit, work, and play, it's sitting in my face. And so when I think about what we're doing at the museum, that we're telling untold stories. You know, a lot of our history hasn't been told. We don't know that. We don't know them. Our children don't know them. Our adults don't know them. And so we're intentional about making sure that we share that information so that the world knows the kind of remarkable things that our African ancestors have done, not just our ancestors, but even our current day. And so, you know, I think the removal of these monuments that support hate and white supremacy and anything that goes against collaboration and collegiality and love and respect, I think those things do have to be removed. They don't have to be destroyed, but they removed from public places. And, you know, when I look around Charleston, there aren't very many Black monuments that I can go and visit or take my kids, nieces and nephews to go and visit. But there's a plethora of them that are here that don't support love and peace. And so how are we going to talk about those things? How are we going to address that? And I think it's a long conversation. I think it's a very long and hard conversations. And I agree with you, Mr. Rosen. I don't see why it should be that difficult for us to have these conversations. But unfortunately, I think when people see removing of monuments, it's removing the history. And it really is just removing of the honor of it in a public way. So I think there's more to do. We have to have some equity around the celebration of all people. And Charleston doesn't represent that right now, in my view.
Thank you. I think we lost Representative Moore, but hopefully he can join us. I know he was having some problems getting in to the call. Reverend Jenkins, you raised an important point about historians. And in some of these debates, professional historians, scholars are not included or haven't had a role. What is the proper role of an academic, of an academically trained historian, of a historical scholar in answering some of these questions?
I think their input is valuable. I think they have perspective scholarly, and I think they have perspective personally and emotionally. And you know, what I have shared with someone in the past, I was invited to serve on a panel, and it had a lot to do with history. And I refused to be on that panel because there was an insult culturally for me to be on that panel, and the folks of my culture and who serve in those capacities were not. They were not invited to be on the panel. And I felt like it was a disgrace for me to step in when they had not been invited, because they deserve to be at that seat at that table, not me. And so, you know, sometimes we just have to just take that stand and say, you know, these are the other people who really should be here, as opposed to myself. But I think having their voices here, I believe that, you know, we should use lay people and just everyday people to have their voices heard as well. So it could be an opportunity for both and to be a part of the dialogue, but I'd never want to omit them. because they add value and they bring value to these conversations.
Thank you.
Can I add? I got disrupted with. I'm having technical issues.
That's all right.
I had to find my Mophie. I've been having phone issues. But I wanted to say and excuse me if I'm any redundancy here. The one thing I wanted to talk about when we talk about our history, and especially when we talk as it relates to who do we honor specifically around statues and monuments and that kind of thing. There's an old saying, and I think most of us know it: "To the victor goes the spoil." So in other words, a lot of times the stories, his story that is told often is to the victor. And for example, the monument that recently came down at Marion Square of Calhoun, it is true that that he's probably one of the most decorated politicians in the history of the state. But there's so many people's stories that he negatively affected that were never told. People who were trying to fight against the oppression that oftentimes he was supportive of. That if they were victorious, potentially they would have been memorialized. So I think some of the challenges that we have to confront as it relates to history and this idea of the rewriting of history isn't the fact that it's being rewritten. Most of the time, it's been one-sided, right? Stories have only been told by those that were victorious, and the pain and the struggle and also the triumphs of those that weren't victorious don't get told. So I think history, that's why to go to Robert's point about having a monument of Denmark Vesey is so important, because that revolt was not successful. But the story, his story, is so important to be highlighted and told.
Well, the Calhoun Monument thing was very difficult. The bottom line is the city council voted unanimously to take it down. That's quite a statement, because the city council is very rarely unanimous about anything. And so I do think, whatever your position is on monuments, the fact is the city council voted to take it down. The city had the authority to take it down because the statue had been given to the city. I mean, it was a quirky legal issue, and so the point is, that's democracy in action. In other words, if the majority of people no longer feel that a monument is appropriate, that it's causing more pain to people than it's worth, well, then the people have a right to take the monument down. I mean, no one, I think that's the fundamentals of, I realize Donald Trump right now is trying to overturn the presidential election, but the rest of us, I think, still believe in democracy, which is that the majority should rule, And so,
Well, now, hey, neighbor, be careful there, Mr. Ross.
I better be careful. I'm sorry. Well, I guess I let fly what my political leanings were in that respect. But anyway, I guess the point I'm making is that the Calhoun Monument debate was an important debate. Calhoun was the foremost defender of slavery in American history. And I mean, there's reasoning behind the statue coming down. But each one of these monuments has a different story. I guess that's kind of where I am, is that each monument stands on its own, and each one has to be looked at. And so, I think that I do think we've made a pact with the past. People gave money to put up a monument or name something, and we made a pact. These people are dead. They're not here to defend themselves. and they made a gift. Now we're saying, we're not gonna give you the money back, but we're gonna just tear down what you gave us. I mean, I do think
So
we ought to have some respect. You know,
I want to
conflict.
ask you a question about that, because I'm curious, how do you square that with what you just said about democratic processes? If
Yeah, well,
if people had given their money for something that was decided in an undemocratic fashion, that not everyone participated in that decision.
Yes.
Yes. How do you see that as something that deserves to continue to stand, as opposed to the city council voting to take down a statue?
Well, I just think you have to look at each subject on its own merit. In other words, you know, there's been some statues taken down and some things that have happened that I think are very hypocritical. You know, I wrote this op-ed a week or two ago. They made big fanfare at Yale. Now, I went to Harvard, so I don't have any use for Yale. Hey,
Well,
so
that's number two.
these small-minded people at Yale, who you keep talking about scholars. Well, there's scholars and there's scholars. Okay, so the scholars at Yale found out that John C. Calhoun was a slave owner, so they took his name off the college. Okay, all right, fine. But the same scholars also found out that the college is named for Elihu Yale, who was a slave trader. I mean, he probably murdered thousands of people. He was in India and he shipped slaves from Africa. He made a fortune in the slave trade. He was 100 times worse than John C. Calhoun. But notice they haven't changed the name of Yale, right? Every other college at Yale is named for a slaveholder. Cotton Mather, all of these New England people, they're all slaveholders, okay? So they got one rule for a white Southerner who they can make a big show about, but when it comes to their own family at Yale, Yale is named for a slave trader. Now that's just a fact. So my point being, yes, whose story is being undone, whose story is being preserved? Well, Harvard, Yale, Brown University, the Brown family was the biggest slave traders in New England. They made a fortune in the slave. Brown University is built on slavery, but they're not changing those names. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm not sure where you draw the line with this, okay? And Yale, of course, is just a monument to hypocrisy, a monument to hypocrisy.
Well, a Harvard man would say that, but and I say that
John
as
Harvard
one.
was the slave owner.
You know, back to this question of democracy, though, and democratic decision making. We've got something in South Carolina that's colloquially called the Heritage Act, and the long and short of it basically is that if you're going to change the name of anything in the state, it has to have a 2/3 approval of the General Assembly. Now, Representative Moore, that's the world you live in. I'm curious to get your views on what you think of that approach, and how it does fit with this notion that if we're going to even look at these monuments and statues on a case-by-case basis, if we take a democratic approach, does that address the issue in a fair way to you?
Well, I think the thing that we learn, and I'm learning as I I'm entering in my third year in elected office, is that often isn't about fairness when it comes to the decision making. We all know that it was only less than 100 years ago that African Americans were given the right to vote, even though we were very instrumental in building this country, especially the economic engine that this country has become. So I think fair is a subjective word that oftentimes it's based on to the victor goes the spoil. And I think the challenging part is, especially when you talk about something as specific as the Heritage Act, in a lot of ways, I'm kind of torn with it, because it makes a great debate, because what it does is force those of us, I'm 35 years old, to really examine our history and really understand why we are where we are, for the good and for the not so good for some people. And so, is it democracy at its best, 2/3 majority in the House? If you're on the side that has the majority, you would say yes. But those of us that find ourselves in the minority, not just from a political affiliation, but a belief that we should re-examine how we celebrate South Carolinians, because there are a number of South Carolinians, both Black and white, that are deserving of being honored and being highlighted as a part of our heritage. So it's one of those things that I go back to kind of where I landed before, to the victor goes the spoil. So I think it's just incumbent upon us to have these conversations, these tough conversations. I tell you what, I greatly appreciate Robert and Carl being on this call, and Pastor Jenkins, to get these different perspectives, because I think it's vitally important, and we need to be doing more of these conversations, because I find myself, as we're talking, really getting passionate, and I have my wheels all are turning, thinking about how we navigate through it.
Thank you. And Carl, we don't want to leave you out of this. I know you might not be able to see all these faces here, but if you have something to contribute, I want you to have a chance to jump in.
Oh, no, I'm listening and learning, because sometimes the best way to learn is to keep your mouth shut. I would say I learned that from Robert, but that's not true. But anyhow, and I forgot. Also,
Carl, I get paid to talk, so it's hard for me to listen.
I know. But I didn't mean to leave Robert out of being in the neighborhood where I grew up, because he grew up there as well. But anyway, I think everything that's been said is very important. Now, the Heritage Act, I don't really have any comment on that. Suffice to say that the legislature made that decision. Therefore, we basically have to go with it until such time as the issues are brought up again and it's revisited and rehashed, and maybe come up with something else. The thing about monuments that I like to do, and this is where I draw back to the history point, and it's been said, when you see a monument, most people today don't know why that monument is there, and that's Robert's point. And of course, none of us were here 150 years ago when they were put up anyway, and all of the pomp and circumstances that went with that. But my thing on the monuments is, okay, so we had a statue of John C. Calhoun sitting in Marion Square for all these years, and we got to that quirky issue that Robert talked about, that I'm very familiar with. And the question came to me, well, why don't, people stand up and say anything? Well, who was John C. Calhoun, and what did he do? Okay, you go get your books out and you learn all about John C. Calhoun. Then, based on your own culture, heritage, or whatever, you make a decision in your own mind. Did he do the right thing, or did he do the bad thing? Now, in his time, his ideas were basically the same as everybody else around him. He may have been a little bit different, and he was quite eccentric from what I remember. But anyway, so you learn from that, and then you go. As far as the democracy is concerned, with the council unanimously agreeing to take the statue down, well, I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's their prerogative, and that's what they decided to do, and so on and so forth. I can tell you that the base that the statue was on, they're still chipping away at that, and they'll be chipping away for another couple of months, because the base was a lot stronger than everything else around it. However, so you go to the museum or you go to the library and you pull out the books and you find out everything you need to find out about John C. Calhoun. You're also going to find many different writers and authors who wrote negative opinions about John C. Calhoun. And you have to read those too. So that's where your history comes in, and that's where your heritage comes in, as to whether you agree with it or not.
And
And
it
if
takes
you don't
us, it takes us
Right.
back.
Yeah, if you,
It takes us back to the point that Reverend Jenkins was making about a need for scholars, a need for historians to be a part of this discussion. But the other
Well,
question I
I
have
agree.
is, and thank you for that, Carl. The other question I have is, what does leadership look like on this issue of the future of the past, and how we memorialize and remember people from the past? What does it look like right now, and who's displaying it, in your opinion? Do you see it? Who's leading on this issue?
I don't see any leadership in, as far as the past and the future is concerned.
Okay.
I see a lot of one-sided opinions, but I don't see discussion that would take into account everybody's or a lot of different people's thinking and what they stand for, where they've been, where they've gone, and all of that.
And
It's
I can see as you're
divisive.
I can see as you're talking, Carl, everyone else is looking at their thinking spot. You know, when people think, they look in a certain direction or whatever. And I'm looking on the screen here, and the other three folks, while you're talking, are thinking about that too. So we'll give them a chance to jump in here.
I do think that Reverend Nelson Rivers of Charity Missionary Baptist Church has been on the forefront for many years talking about this very subject. You know, I think there are times that for people who we may define as radical or extremely outspoken, sometimes their voices get covered because they really say what it is they think and what they feel. And sometimes that's an uncomfortable place for people. And so we don't tend to invite them to the table unless they have to be at the table, only when it's an absolute necessary. So someone like him, and who I know, who has been talking about these subject matters for a while, is very vocal about it. And so I would consider him one of the community leaders that's addressing these kinds of issues. I know that a lot of these things that we are talking about and addressing, they're uncomfortable. I mean, it's the nature of the beast. It's what it is. But if we're going to try to make change, and we're trying to create harmony, and we're trying to create a democracy of equality and fairness, then we have to even bring those people we're not always comfortable with to be at the table and hear their voices as well. Maya Angelou has a quote that says, "The more you know your history, the more liberated you are." And that's a fact for me. You know, the more I have learned about my culture and my history, the more it has empowered me to be my better and best self. And that's a continuation of being on a daily basis. And I say that for not just for me as an African-American woman, but that applies to anybody. The more history you know of your history, the more liberated you should be. Now, liberated is the key word here. What is liberating doing for you? Is it empowering you to be a better person? Or are you liberated to continue to restore the hateful part of the history or the negative part of the history? Be liberated and to be better, and see equality and justice and fairness and love and peace. And I know those are words, but those are words that we can operate our lives out of, and how we can be in our best selves in that.
Thank you.
When I think about the question, I often think about the creatives in our community. I think about the Jonathan Greens that really highlight our past in the Gullah Geechee community. And I also think about the new age artists like Clemente Nelson and Benjamin Starr and Fletcher Williams. So, I think oftentimes when we want, for me anyway, when I want to look at how we're writing our history and connecting history in modern time, you often should look to the creatives, the artisans, the poets and the painters, the sculpturists, and they are telling the current story, and a lot of them are pulling from our history. So I think that's why I led with the transition that I think we're going through as a community, and I see it, and I often look to the creatives, and I also go to the young people. When both times I ran for office, both in 2018 and then for reelection in 2020, my campaign was predominantly ran by not just folks working on the ground, but my campaign manager was under the age of 25. My comms director was under the age of 21. And a lot of the people that were a part of my inner circle were these young people of all colors, of all genders, really, for me anyway, helping me better understand. I'm 35, but better understand the next generation after me. And some of my key advisors were those a generation or two above me. So I think it's happening, and I think people in different ways are recording it. I think we're doing it right now. I mean, this is a way that digitally that we will preserve this conversation, and it'll be shared, and so we're actively being a part of writing the history of our time. So I think it's always happening, and there's a lot of folks that are pulling from the past. So I think it's continuously happening, whether we think we're doing it or not. It's happening organically.
Representative Moore, I can't tell you how powerful that is with your guitar or whatever instrument that is.
That's a guitar,
right behind
yeah.
you, as you're talking about creatives and understanding that so many of these monuments, these are works of art. These are creative works that we're talking about that are depictions of certain worldviews and certain points of view. And even if we're talking about new works of art, we're talking about things that can express what is so often difficult to express in words. There's a reason why art exists, right? So I want to thank you for sharing that. And also, as we're about to close, just to share with this group and with our audience that there's broad agreement that we want to move forward. As we look at some of the results from the survey, the report that we've commissioned as part of the Charleston Forum, an overwhelming majority believe that that it's important to build bridges to improve racial relations in the Tri-County area. 85, almost 85%. 70% of the people believe that the tragic events at Mother Emanuel have helped to bring the community get together. And a majority of people believe that race relations can improve, and they're interested in having them improve. So against that backdrop, my final question for you all, and I'd like to hear from each of you briefly in sentences and not paragraphs. What?
You invite a bunch of talkers to come on. What do you
Yeah,
expect?
I know. Given that there is interest in seeing that this community is more inclusive and seeing that it is grappling honestly with its past, what's next? What should be next? What do you want to see next?
Listen, I think, you know, when to see the community come together when the massacre of Mother Emanuel happened, I would like to see the same thing when Walter Scott got shot. Like the community didn't gather in the same way for that injustice, but yet they did for Mother Emanuel. So I think we've got to figure out, you know, are we extending our hand of love and touching and agreeing with each other on all injustices, or are we deciding when that is? And so I didn't see the same thing when Walter Scott got shot by the police. You know, and the community that I saw came together was the African-American community. I didn't see the hands of everyone. And so I think there's some conversation we have to come to around when we talk about love, not hate, where does that apply? And are we applying that when we decide it needs to apply, or does that apply at all times?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, on the topic of monuments, I mean, I'd like to see some leadership. I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any leadership at all. In other words, you know, when Bernie and I wrote this op-ed, we said, look, let's build some monuments. Let's do some things. The reaction to that was zero. You know, I think people prefer fighting over things rather than creating things. And so nothing would make me happier than to see some real leadership to fill in the gaps. I mean, there's plenty of things. I mean, South Carolina's got an incredible African-American history, plenty of heroes, plenty of people to honor, plenty of places to build them, and plenty of money to do it. But I've seen no leadership on that. And I think, you know, we have a lot of committees and we have a lot of reports and we have a lot of finger pointing, but I'd like to see something constructive. Now, the African American International Museum is the most constructive thing because that is the biggest project going on in history in Charleston. That's true. But with regard to the monuments in particular, I would like to see some leadership. I haven't seen any leadership.
Thank you.
I'll go
I think
next. Go ahead, Carl.
I was just going to kind of add to that a little bit, and I think time is going to heal a lot of wounds and it'll heal a lot of issues. Continued talking and discussions will pave the way. I call Brian, and I'm just going to mention this one other thing and then I'll quit. I'll keep the paragraph short. I mentioned to Brian early today that over the last week and a half or so, I have asked 10 to 15 people that I know real well, have they ever heard of the Charleston Forum? And not one of them said that they had. Not one. Until Brian called me, I had never heard of it. So how the word is getting out, somebody that's better at marketing than I am need to, pursue this a little bit. But anyway, that's all well and good. I think the museum is going to be a good thing because the colored people, as I call them, because that's the generation that I come from, did a lot for the state of South Carolina, did a lot for Charleston. So, you know, how we honor them and how we do that, I don't know. I wouldn't even venture a guess as to how that needs to happen. But anyway, suffice to say that I think the museum will probably answer a lot of questions.
Thank
But
you.
I've enjoyed here today.
Thank you for joining us.
And I
Representative
guess I'll,
Moore, we're going to
yeah,
give
I
you the
guess,
last word.
yeah, I guess I'll put a button on it. And I'm an elected official, so please excuse me if I go on for a paragraph. But
An AME minute, not a Baptist minute.
Oh, don't talk about the Baptists. Don't do that.
Yeah, amen. But here's what I'll say. I think a lot of us were. I think we had mixed feelings about the appearance of unity after Mother Emanuel. Because what I'm always land on is that real equity and real justice is more than an act of holding hands and singing, and folks finally going to a church service that don't look like them. Real justice and real equality has to do about what Reverend Jenkins said earlier when she talked about King and Spring, when you talk about inclusion in the economy, because for the genesis of Charleston, African Americans have been the engine that have fueled the economy for this area when it comes to rice, when it comes to other agricultural pieces. So I think it's just important that when we're really talking about unity, that we do it in equality, we do it from an economic standpoint, and social is important too. But for me, the economic piece, it's always my dad would always tell me something that for the longest I thought he coined, but it come to find out that it was someone more wiser than he. Is that if you want to know what a person's priority is, look how they spend their money. Check the ledger on their checkbook. And so that's really my focus. That's the task that I have, and I challenge all of us on this call to do. How can we work together to, as Charleston continues to grow and develop, have real inclusion as it comes to economics? Because I think just naturally, based on the young people that I surround myself around, the social piece is happening. But we just have to make sure that the economic piece is in synergy with the socialization of people and the connection of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I thank you for that. And I thank you all for joining us for this conversation that we're having at the end of a historic year. Certainly a year that we'll all remember, and a part of the past that we'll carry forward and mark in our own ways. In this season of hope, it is my hope that we continue to work together and have those uncomfortable conversations about creating hope for everyone in the community, about restoring hope for people in our communities, and building a place where 50 years from now, we can say that the one word that describes it all is us. So thank you all. Happy holidays, and take care.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all.